We are on the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad. Despite the fact that 8 decades have passed since that confrontation, we are still carrying out analyses and debates about what happened. Was Paulus to blame for the defeat? Why didn't he dare to give the order to get out of the encirclement? What would have happened if Paulus had broken through the encirclement on his own and left with his traps towards the new German front lines? Later in this program, we are going to make the most complete assessment possible about what would have happened in Stalingrad and throughout the German southern flank, if Paulus had given the order to abandon the mythical city on the Volga. To do this, we are going to take into account as much data as possible, and the evolution of the intense confrontations that were taking place on the entire Eastern Front. And it is that without a doubt, Paulus has been the most criticized and stigmatized German general of the Second World War for not having made precisely this decision. It all started when a few weeks after the start of the new German offensive on the Eastern Front in 1942, the German leader decided to change his plans. Although at first the plans of Operation Blue did not include the capture of the city of Stalingrad, when they were modified on July 25, everything changed. As if that were not enough, in this Hitler directive known as Number 45, the Red Army was considered defeated. By the end of August, the vanguards of Army Group B began to reach the city of Stalingrad, where no special resistance was initially expected. As paradoxical as it may seem, their advance was delayed by lack of supplies due to logistical collapse and by poor roads in the Soviet Union. Thus, already from that very early date some 300 Ju-52 aircraft were sent so that they could supply the German vanguards. It was on August 23 when the first German units arrived in the city, which, as General Kleist himself said, was just one more city of the hundreds they had already taken. During those last days of August and beginning of September, a series of intense combats began both inside the city and in its surroundings, because Stalin, who had already convinced himself that the Germans were not going to attack Moscow during that summer, began to send to Stalingrad as many troops as possible. During mid-September, the Soviet High Command, led by Zhukov and Vasilevsky, designed what was to be the future Uranus operation that would surround the Germans in Stalingrad, and since then, preparations for the plan began. The Germans for their part continued to advance into the city for an urban combat for which they were not prepared, assuming ever greater casualties. The orders that Paulus received over and over again from Hitler's headquarters were to take Stalingrad as soon as possible, and to spare no forces or resources for it. The general idea was that the Red Army was exhausted and practically beaten, and there was nothing to worry about. Finally, while Paulus was launching one of the last offensives inside the city, with which he intended to conquer it definitively, on November 19 the Soviets began their offensive. At first there was not much alarm among the Germans, who considered that it was a local offensive, which in no case had the intention of advancing towards their rear. The most important measure was the intervention of the 48th Panzer Corps, which was made up of the Romanian 1st Armored Division, and the German 22nd Panzer Division. Due to their low number of main battle tanks, as well as the fact that most of them were Czech 38T models, they could not do anything to stop the Soviets. As the hours passed, the German commanders in Stalingrad became increasingly concerned, realizing that this was not just a local attack. The main proof of this was that the attack on the northern flank on November 19 was joined by another in the south on the 20th. If there could still be any disbelievers, by the 21st and 22nd the Soviet intentions were more than clear, and on November 23 some 265,000 Axis soldiers were encircled at Stalingrad. This was the first time Paulus could have given the order to evacuate the city and join the rest of the German forces left outside, but it would certainly have been rash. At that time, the magnitude of the offensive and the consequences it would have in the future were still unknown. On this occasion, this event had occurred in the main German sector, where they were supposed to be strongest, and there was no reason to think that in a few days they would not be able to reverse the situation. Thus, having left the city at that time would have been a somewhat hasty act, and would have meant losing all the sacrifice that the German army had been making in the city for months. It goes without saying that all the orders that Paulus was receiving from Hitler's headquarters were for him to hold firm in the city, and that they would soon solve the situation from outside. As we all know, one of the main problems that Paulus had was that if they were not able to get supplies to him by air, his troops were going to suffer a total weakening in a few weeks. Another fact to take into account is that Paulus's army was based in the territory and was preparing to spend the winter there. This means that he did not have a rapid reaction capacity like an army that is in the advance phase or mobile reserve. In addition, they had parted with the horses that they no longer needed to move, so ordering a quick mobilization of their troops was very complicated. So, and taking into account that a complete assessment of the situation could not yet be made, it was best to hold out a bit until the best solution was found. This would come about 20 days later when Manstein's rescue group was able to get to within 50 kilometers of the troops surrounded in the city. Although on this occasion everything indicated that Paulus would make the decision to go out to meet Manstein, finally the commander of the 6th Army decided to be faithful to the orders sent by Hitler, and remained fixed in the city. Although today we can assess that the best option to get out of the siege would have been during the last days of November, since we know the final result, it is most likely that if we had been there we would have chosen the second option during the 14th or December 15th. It is precisely here where we are going to assess what would have happened in the event that Paulus's units had evacuated the city. After realizing for almost 3 weeks that his position was lost, and that his troops were getting very weak due to the meager supplies the Luftwaffe could get to them, Paulus decides that he has to get out of there. Although the orders received are to hold out until the end, Paulus has to prepare his troops to break the siege and meet with the rescue group without the information reaching the German high command. This is a very difficult decision because they have to abandon a lot of equipment and weapons that they will not be able to transport, as well as wounded and debilitated soldiers who are likely to greatly delay the breakout operation. By the beginning of December, the area that the Germans control in the vicinity of Stalingrad is enormous, and their troops are scattered all over the perimeter, so they have to cede much of this territory in order to regroup. It is going to be a very complicated operation, as the soldiers are going to find themselves fighting in the middle of the Russian steppe, with practically no support from heavy equipment or aviation. The estimated number of casualties will be very high, but it will be even higher if they remain in the city. Operation Winter Storm began on December 12 with the mission of reaching Stalingrad. At this point Paulus has two options. The first is to start his attack from the city that same day, or leave it for a few days later, and thus give the rescue party a little time to close the distance. Because the second option is more favorable for Paulus's men, the German general decides on the latter option. To do this, Paulus has divided his forces into three, forming something similar to a triangle. The western vertex will be in charge of breaking the front, while it will have two wings that will protect it from foreseeable Soviet counterattacks. All these regrouping movements try to disguise themselves as an improvement in the defensive measures facing the German high command. Still, it is inevitable that once Paulus's forces break out of the encirclement, Hitler will find out. So his first move is to remove Paulus and counterorder the 6th Army back to Stalingrad. Due to the chaotic and confusing situation, he himself assumes command of the 6th Army while looking for a candidate to send to the Stalingrad pocket to comply with orders. The reality is that at this moment nothing and no one can stop what has already started, and some soldiers who know that their hopes of survival are nil if they stay in the city, continue their attack in a westerly direction. The Soviet reaction was not long in coming either, and the multiple armies that were surrounding Stalingrad now rushed against the exposed German troops. The situation of the 6th Army is critical, as its tanks barely have gasoline or ammunition, and most of its larger caliber anti-tank guns have had to be abandoned. This makes the T-34 wreak real havoc with each other. In Hitler's headquarters, the most tense moment of the entire war is taking place, only equaled by what happened during the month of December 1941 with the Soviet counterattack. With totally confused information and being unable to get hold of the situation, Hitler has no choice but to delegate Manstein for now. After about 4 days of marching by the rescue group, and 3 by the surrounded troops, on December 19 both units made contact with each other. The conditions of the men coming from Stalingrad are terrible, and both General Ross and General Hoth have no choice but to cover the units that are withdrawing from the city with their rescue forces. At the same time that this is taking place, the Soviets have launched a general offensive along the entire southeastern front, from the city of Voronezh to Grozny. The main danger of this operation is that the Soviets reach Rostov before the Germans can remove all their units that are further south of that position. Of the 200,000 German coalition soldiers who withdrew from Stalingrad, only 30,000 to 40,000 have been saved, with more than 50,000 falling in the desperate fighting to escape. The remaining 100,000 soldiers have been taken prisoner, either because the Soviets ended up cutting them off from the main group, or because of the chaotic situation they were left behind. I make a small paragraph here to comment that these figures are those that occurred during the flight from the siege of Halbe in Berlin, in a situation similar to that of Stalingrad. So it seemed to me that the most appropriate thing to do would be to base ourselves on this case to speculate on the survival rate of this hypothetical evasion. Although the casualties may seem high, we have to remember that of the 100,000 prisoners taken by the Soviets in early February 1943, only 5,000 survived captivity. The rest of the other 100,000 that remained in the bag at the beginning of December 1942 were dying in the combats that winter, to which must be subtracted some 40,000 soldiers who could finally be rescued by air. Thus, we can see that in general terms, the number of troops saved would not have been very different, with the only nuance that those 40,000 or 50,000 men who had reached the German lines would have been immediately available for combat in the sector. Another factor is that the evasion carried out would have been sold as a German success, and very possibly would not have affected German morale so negatively, nor the Soviets so positively. In any case, and given the critical nature of the situation, the damage to Germany had already been done, and the impact of this rescue on troops that were totally crushed and weakened could hardly have improved the situation much. We can conclude that the German withdrawal to the line of the Meuse River would have had to be done equally, and everything would have depended on that Manstein counteroffensive in March 1943. It is clear that the best time to have withdrawn from Stalingrad would have been during the very moment in which the encirclement was taking place, when Paulus's troops were in a considerably good situation. However, at that first moment it was really difficult to assess the situation at a general level, let alone foresee what was going to happen next, which is why I consider that no general in his situation would have ordered a total evacuation at that first opportunity. In any case, everything we have told here is still speculation, which may be more or less accurate about what really happened. But what about you? What do you think? What do you think would have been the outcome of it all? We say goodbye here. Thank you all for being part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.